Hi everybody, Joe Konkoly in the shop. Today we're going to talk to Mike Hoenerhoff, and we're going to take a look at this Les Paul he's got. Needs a refret, and that leads us to a conversation about nibs. What are nibs, you might ask? I might pose the same question to Mike. What are nibs?
Nibs are the Les Paul in question. This is a mid-70s Les Paul custom. And the nibs are the little bit of binding that cover the end of the fret. You can see where they were. I obviously already got the frets pulled out of here. These little bits of binding cover the fret ends. Now, they're really, really pronounced on this newer 2016 SG. You can see it's got these big old massive nibs that cover the fret ends. And the reason that they're there is because of the way that Gibson makes their fingerboards, or I should say made, because a lot of models they don't put the nibs on anymore.
Yeah, it is somewhat a thing of the past.
Basically, the fingerboard is slotted and radiused and then fretted, and then it's tapered, and then the binding goes on, and they scrape the binding up from around.
So the fingerboard is off the guitar, and it is shaped and prepared and ready to go. The inlays are put in, and the frets are put in, and then the binding is glued to the edge. And that binding sits up a little bit taller than the edge of the fingerboard. It sits up about as tall as the fret, probably.
Yeah, and obviously on this newer one, the nibs are pretty much the same height as the frets. This is an older one this is also a 70s Les Paul, and the nibs are a little bit more subdued. Mm-hmm. You can kind of see that the fret end is a lot more tapered. It kind of has that, what I call like the Gibson fret end. It's just sort of a slope that just sort of goes down. It's not, sharply defined. And, I see why the nibs exist from a manufacturing standpoint. Obviously, they felt it was more efficient to bind around the frets rather than, bevel and shape the fret ends and everything like that. Mm-hmm. From a player standpoint, a lot of people like them. They think it's a little bit more comfortable. You don't feel as much of that seasonal fluctuation with your fret ends that you might feel with over the binding fret.
Yeah. So, but of course, you pointed out a negative. That same thing you're talking. You don't feel as much seasonal change because the fretboard is a unfinished piece of wood, and so when it takes on moisture in the summer, it can swell. When it loses moisture in the winter, it can shrink. But the fret is made of metal; it doesn't move nearly as much. So when the fretboard shrinks, on an unbound fretboard where the frets are sized right to the edge of the board, when the board shrinks, the frets tend to stick out and feel sharp. You don't get that with the bound board. But what do you get?
So as the fingerboard shrinks and everything pulls in, but the fret doesn't move, so it essentially sort of pushes out, you can get what we see here on this binding where you have a little crack at the edge of every fret. And you see this on over binding frets as well, but it's usually because the tang wasn't nipped back far enough. If it's done properly, this doesn't really happen.
In an extreme case, you see that crack, and the binding then will, be glued to the side of the fingerboard here and come out to the fret each one, which can. The only way truly to fix that is to remove the binding and file the fret ends flush all the way down.
The reason that we got talking about this is because obviously I'm refretting this, and Steve recently did a refret on a Les Paul where someone wanted to keep the nibs. Some players really concerned with the vintage accuracy and aesthetics and things like that, and they want the nibs preserved. In the case of this board had been dressed so many times, the nibs had been worn down to they were almost nothing anyways. So it wasn't even a question here. But you can imagine a guitar like this where you've played it so much, you've worn through the frets, and you need to replace the frets, but you still have a lot of nib there. People might want to keep those nibs. I always try to talk everyone out of it. as is pretty much everyone here, because
Let's talk about what kind of fretting style you're going to do on this guitar, because we're not going to have nibs on it.
sure.
And that will lead us to, and that will show you how difficult it is to do the fret
Right.
and do the refret and preserve the nibs.
So I already have these frets prepped that are going to go into this guitar. In each one, you could see I have nipped off the tang where it's going to overhang the fret, filed off that little bit so it's nice and clean. So this portion of the fret, which has been notched out, is going to sit on top of that binding there. If you were trying to keep the nibs, you need to super precisely radius every piece of fret wire. You need to super precisely trim it to the exact width that it's going to go in.
And fit right in between those two little pieces
And
of
then
plastic.
it never does, so you always need to fill it in with a little bit of, some scrap binding melted with acetone and sort of make this sludge that you can put into that seam. That's another thing I don't like about nibs is, you get this expansion, contraction, and if you're in a point where the binding gets pushed away from the fret and then it doesn't shrink back, you got this gap there that a lot of players complain about, how their high E string hangs up and catches between the nib and the fret.
Yeah, the string can actually, if there is a small gap there, the string can fit in it and get caught in there.
The other thing that is not good, in my opinion, about keeping nibs on a fretboard when you're refretting is, if the guitar's, 20, 30 years old, wood's not perfect. It's not going to stay perfectly flat through its whole lifetime. It's going to get some wiggles and twists and contortions, and that's one of the reasons you do a refret. It's one of the things that's nice about a refret. You can plane the board true. You start with a nice, fresh, flat surface.
Yeah, so anything that those changes in humidity cause, or the strings pulling up, and any oddities that occur in the neck and the fretboard, when you refret, pull the frets, and you can true that surface however you want. If you have to maintain that little piece of plastic at the end of the fret, it really limits your ability to do so.
Yeah, you can maybe take it a little bit in the middle, but then you're going to throw your radius off if you do too much. So really nicer just to grind them off, and I love doing that. It makes me feel so.
And I would agree. I think that's one of the keys. The key pluses to refretting in guitar, usually you think of refretting guitar where mostly what you're getting is a new set of frets. But in addition to that, you're getting that opportunity to recondition the fingerboard and really put it back in all the geometry exactly where you want it, like it was from the beginning. And then when you put in the frets and you seat them all the same, they reflect that same geometry that you've sanded into the board.
And that's another thing. If you can't plane the board true, you put the frets in, they're all squirrely and weird. It's going to take you twice as long to dress them. That's going to be even more cost to the customer. So.
And you lose some of the fret height. If certainly one of the reasons you put new frets is to get a brand new tall fret. And if you have to take some of that material off because of the oddities of the board that you would normally take out of the board itself before you put the frets in, you lose some fret height.
Another reason I'm not super big on partial refrets unless there's a really, really good case for one. Because, typically you end up having to take so much off the frets, they're already, 2/3 of the way to a refret anyways.
We prefer to do fret levels on a set of frets till it's time to replace them rather than doing partial refrets because of what Mike was just saying. You don't get the opportunity to true the whole board up, and so when you put those new frets in, that transition between the last old fret and the first new fret can be very difficult to negotiate and have the geometry work out.
One thing that they did like we mentioned, they put the frets in, and then they put the binding on over the frets, and they scrape the binding from in between each fret. So, on this end, you can see the binding was scraped down so far, it's already really close to the position markers. So I'm gonna have to be really, really careful when I plane this board not to. And there's it's got a really substantial bevel on the edges, so I don't think it's gonna be a huge problem, but I do have to be careful when I'm playing this and maintaining the radius that I don't take too much off of this binding, otherwise we're gonna have
you can see that
exposed dots.
the very top part of each of those round dot markers is already sort of taken off. And that is something that we see on a guitar that is fretted originally with the nibs on it. As it gets fret leveled over time, people start taking those nibs off and doing more and more extreme things to the edge of that fretboard, which can cause problems.
I like this. Speaking of interesting things, an interesting washer on this truss rod situation.
Yeah, looks like
We've got some
tuner bushing, a pressed-in tuner bushing.
Some proper half moon washers I'll throw in there for
Sometimes
this fella.
when you work at a guitar store with mounds of parts lying around, you have to improvise. That's what you got to do. So one of the things that I'm thinking about standing back from this discussion is the nibs are created in a production factory situation where they're thinking about how they want to put the whole guitar together. And the refret that we're talking about without the nibs is a post-construction repairman's view of the thing, but the key there is that we're trying to control the top surface of that fretboard to do what we want, which even in a construction situation I would like to do.
Yeah.
I think that there is you have to really understand the size of the fret slot and the size of the fret tangs that's going in there and the glue that you're using to glue the board on and that whole situation to be able to fret the board before you put it on the neck, and then have that all work out in the end, so that because so there's a lot of
You have to be really confident in your construction methods, because you get like one little grain of funny stuff in between the fingerboard and the neck when you're gluing it on, you got a bump there, and that's gonna come out of the frets. You can't plane it out of the board after it's on there. So.
Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of builders and makers and factories are realizing that, and they're looking for that same control. The guitar is put together and finished, and then you can take whatever fret surface you've got left and true it up and make sure it's perfect before you put the frets in. But of course, yep. But of course, and of course, hammering in or pressing in frets after once you've got a completely finished guitar is a whole different process too. It's a more time-consuming, dangerous process.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
So,
almost pretty much everyone frets before they finish. That's.
Most makers do.
I don't know
most
anyone who
manufacturers have the nut in there, so you see a little finish on the end of the nut, and the frets are in. And so whatever little oddities are created by beveling the frets into the edge and doing all that hammering and sanding with the frets, you can then clean that all up and put a finish over the ends of it, and you have a more new, perfect-looking guitar. So there are pluses and minuses to both situations.
For sure.
So we looked at a couple different guitars and sort of we were trying to earlier today look at some real timelines to figure out when the Gibson was doing this and that. It was a little difficult to do, as some things are with the history of the Gibson company, to pin down real timelines. But
well, definitely, like in the 50s, they show up. And we were looking at this neck, just from the 30s, and I didn't see any. Maybe a
an
slight
archtop guitar neck,
slight hint of a nib on this second to last fret. I don't think that they might have still been kind of scraping binding a little bit, but I don't think that they were completely installing it over the frets.
One obvious difference between these two necks is the thickness of that binding.
Yeah.
It's probably not even 30 thousandths there, and
really rounded over at the top.
And this looks more like 90 thousandths thick.
Oh yeah, that's
binding. So
it's like an eighth of an inch.
Yeah, or bigger. Yeah, like 125 even. 1/10 of an inch. But so that's another reason why maybe they started doing the nibs, because they started using different thicker binding.
Well, they just became more noticeable, more pronounced.
Yeah.
That's
Right. All right. So the next step on this is to
playing the board.
plane the board. And what tools might you use with that? Got something there?
Yeah, we got my leveling beam here with some 120 grit on there.
Yep, a Stuart McDonald tool that is super flat and quite weighty, so that you don't have to do a lot of maneuvering yourself. Because of the weight, it will, and what it does is it cuts the high spots off, or sands off those pesky little nibs when you need them to be gone. Mm-hmm.
And this, so like I said, most of what I'm going to be doing is in the middle, so I shouldn't have any issues on the binding. But sometimes, if you have a real thinned out fingerboard, you've been in that situation where I might not go 100% of the way with this. I might, get it 75, 80% of the way there and take the rest of any oddities out of the height of the frets, because I don't want to thin that binding down to where you've got the, where you can see the insides of the side position markers.
Yeah, the side, or they're half gone, or whatever.
Or the inlays, you sand the inlays out of the board.
So these new frets go in, and that part that is nipped off fits inside the binding, and this,
a little room
the end of
spare.
the fret hangs over the binding, hence the term, what were you saying there for this
Over
stuff?
fret binding.
Over binding fret.
That's what Gibson was calling it for the newer guitars that didn't have it, and I was like, what you mean, like how everyone else, like literally everyone else in the world does it?
So the fret goes over the binding on the ends.
Yeah. There's no name for it because that's how everybody else does it. So it's just bound
Fret job. Yeah.
bound fret job.
But they think one thing about a bound fret job is that tang is not sticking out the side like on an unbound fret job. You can see the tang sticking out there. It is hidden there. And so it is a cleaner look, and a lot of times it can be a cleaner feel too.
For sure.
Oh, actually, I didn't do the burrows, so.
But of course, one thing that I was bringing up with Mike is that overhanging fret does not have a tang to hold it into the slot. It is hanging out there. So one negative of this style of fretting is over time that fret end tends to be lifted up a little bit. But of course, the reason that happens is the same reason that it can happen to any guitar, whether it's bound, unbound, fretted, nibs, whatever, is that movement of the fingerboard tends to allow the fret to creep out a little bit, and the ends are the first thing to come up.
Are we going to turn this into a discussion about humidity?
We could. Of course.
Nah, we'll just say that's why even on your electric guitars, which a lot of people don't think require humidification, you want to give them a little humidity that keeps weird things from happening with your fretboard and your neck.
And it's obviously the time of year. The furnaces are turning on, and a lot of times the humidifiers don't get turned on at the same time. You don't think about the humidifier for a little while until things get a little dry. And so acoustic guitars, the thinner woods, tend to react quicker to those changes in humidity. But of course, an electric guitar still does, especially the part of an electric guitar that has unfinished wood on it. And humidity in guitars, it's always good to be humidity friendly with your wooden instruments.
Absolutely.
All right.
Alrighty.
I think that's what we got for you today. Nibs, refretting, Les Pauls, all that good stuff. Humidity. Thanks for tuning in. Like us and share us on Facebook, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.